Hello. I am going to be going over a process costing problem for us. And this is the problem here. It's Kelly Paint Company. They use the weighted average method for accounting for costs. And the manufacturers base paint in two separate departments, mixing and packing. The following information is for the mixing department. And they tell you how many units they had in the beginning inventory, how many units they started in March, and a bunch of other information. So I'm going to pull up also the Excel spreadsheet. And let's minimize that so we can get all these numbers here. Okay, so when you're doing your homework, your spreadsheet will look similar to this. And so what we have to do here is fill in the costs, the beginning costs of goods in process. What were they at the beginning of the month? Because you didn't finish everything you had at the end of the month. Last month you still have some products that are in production or in process. And then these are the costs that were incurred during the period to finish these goods and or start new ones. And so they tell us the costs here. Costs in beginning work in process totaled $229,000. $98,000 were in direct materials. So we're going to come over here and we're going to put that in. It says $41,000 in direct labor. And then it says $90,000 in overhead. And then the next line tells us what costs were incurred during March, a total of $165,000. So it says $70,000 for direct materials. Oops, not 70. $35,000 for direct labor. My 3 is sticking on my computer. And $60,000 for overhead. And that should total to the 165, and the line above it should be 229. So these are the total costs that we have to account for when we divide all the units out. The next step in the process is to figure out how many units we have to account for, and that was given to us up here. It says there's a total of 40,000 units in beginning work in process inventory. So we're just going to fill that in, 40,000, beginning work in process. And then 70,000 units were started during March. So units started during the period, 70,000. So we have 110,000 units to account for. Then we need to come over here and say, okay, how many units have we accounted for? And it says that we have 50,000 units were partially completed and remain in ending work in process. So we know that 50,000 units are in ending work in process. Okay, so I have 110,000 over here and 12,000 over here. These two numbers have to equal. And so they didn't give us the number of units that were completed and transferred out. So we have to back into it. We know this number needs to be 110. And we've got 50 already. So we just take the 110. And subtract the 50. And that tells us we have, let me put my formula in here. And that tells us we have 110,000 units accounted for. So 110 here and 110 here. Every problem will give you 3 of the 4 numbers. You'll have to back into the third one that they don't give you. Okay? So we know we have 110,000 units, and we know we have a total cost of $394,000. So then we go down to the next step. The next step, we have to figure out what our equivalent units of production are. So how many units were completed and transferred out? And all the time they are 100% complete, right? Because they are completed and they've already been transferred out. So we know that these are 100% complete. So we can put 60,000 for each of those. All right, so that's coming right from here. And then what are the goods that were in ending goods in process were 50,000. So we're going to put 50,000 units here. It says units of ending goods in process. So number of units, 50,000 for each one. And then we have to go back over to the problem, and they're going to tell us what percent complete each one of these are, because direct materials might be added all at the beginning of the process, so they might be 100% complete, right? Direct labor and factory overhead are going to be some other percentage completion. They might be added as the process goes on. So if we come back over here to the problem, it said 50,000 units were partially completed and remained in ending work in process. 90% were completed for direct materials. So 90% of the 50,000 were completed for direct materials. And I've already got a formula in here to take it. All it's doing is taking the 50,000 units and multiply it times 90%. So we got 45,000 equivalent units for direct material. And then if you keep reading, it says they were 70% complete for direct labor. So I'm going to put 70% in there, and again, it's already doing the math. 50,000 times 70% gives you 35,000 equivalent units. And then when we come back over here, it says they were 30% complete for overhead. So I'm going to put 30 in there. And again, my spreadsheet's already set up to do the math. 50,000 times 30% gives me 15,000. So then if we add the units that were completed and transferred out, and we add the equivalent units for the ending goods in process, we get 105,000 equivalent units of production for direct materials, 95,000, that's the 60,000 they completed plus the 35,000 equivalent units for direct labor, and 75,000 for overhead. That's the 60,000 units completed and the 15,000 equivalent units to come up with the 75,000. So now we have to figure out our equivalent units of production the cost for each equivalent unit of these equivalent units. Okay, so it gave us the beginning cost, and if we go back up here, we'll see it was 98,000. I'm getting it right from here, cost of beginning goods in process, and all I'm doing is transferring these numbers down here. So I've got 98,000 for direct materials, and I've got 41,000 for direct labor, and 90,000 for factory overhead. And then it wants us to put in the costs incurred during the period for these three items. So this is the costs that were incurred during the period. It tells us right there. So 70,000 for direct materials, 35,000 for direct labor, and 60,000 for overhead. Okay? So all we're doing is taking the numbers we already got from the problem and putting them down here. And I already had a formula in here. It's adding up the 98 plus the 70 to give me 168,000 total costs for direct materials, 76,000 for direct labor, and 150 for overhead. Now it's telling us they want that total equivalent units of production that we calculated in the last step to put down here, and we're going to divide these two. So all you have to do is take the numbers that you calculated right here and bring them down. So 105,000 was direct materials, 95,000 was direct labor, and 75,000 was overhead. And I've already got a formula in here, okay? All it's doing is taking the total cost of 168,000 and divide it by the equivalent units that we just calculated in the last step, 105. So we got $1.60 per equivalent unit was added for direct materials. 80 cents of direct labor was added per equivalent unit for direct labor. And $2 was added for every equivalent unit for overhead. Now we have to take these and figure out what are costs assigned to those goods that were transferred out. So there's 60,000 units that were completed and transferred out. How much did they cost? And the 50,000 units that are still sitting in our ending work in process, how much should they be sitting there for? So we know that a cost of the goods that were transferred out were 60,000. All of those were 100% complete for all three of the factors. And what was the cost for direct materials? It was $1.60. What was the cost for direct labor was 80 cents. And the cost that we figured out for overhead was $2. And all it's doing here is taking these and multiplying them. 60,000 times $1.60 is 96. 60,000 times 80 cents is 48. And 60,000 times $2 is 120. Now we need to figure out those 50,000 units that were in ending goods in process, how much cost should be assigned to them. So what was our equivalent units for direct materials? Right, we figured that out here. There were 50,000 units, but they were only 90% complete, so we need to put in 45,000 units. Direct labor, again, there were 50,000 units, but they were only 70% complete, so there was 35,000 equivalent units there. And again, 50,000 total units, but they were only 30% complete for overhead, so we need to put in 15,000 units there. And the cost per equivalent unit is the same. We just bring those down. $1.60 for materials, 80 cents for labor, and $2 for overhead. And again, I've just got a formula in here, and all it's doing is multiplying the 45,000 times the $1.60 to get the 72, 35,000 times the 80 cents to get the 28, and 15,000 times the $2 to get the 30. Okay? When you're finished here, your total cost here, and all it's doing is adding up the 264,000, adding up these three numbers, and then adds up these three numbers, and then it adds these two numbers. So your total cost of $394,000 should agree to the total cost that was added, $394,000. Okay? If it doesn't, you've done something wrong. So again, these two numbers should equal, and the total cost you had up here should equal the total cost that you come up with down here. The very last step is to then take these costs that were good, that were finished and transferred out. We now have to take them out of our work in process inventory because now they're finished, right? They're completed, and they need to be transferred out of the work in process inventory and be put into the finished goods inventory. So we just figured out how much that should be. $264,000 should be assigned to those 60,000 units that we need to transfer out of our work in process inventory and put into our finished goods inventory. So they're both inventories, they're both assets. So in order to increase an asset, we have to debit it, $264,000. Oops, not 5. And in order to decrease an asset, we have to credit it, right? It's still an inventory, so it's still an asset. So $264,000. So it's a little bit different than what we were doing in Accounting 211, because in Accounting 211 we were buying the goods, they were already finished, and we were just turning around, marking them up, and reselling them. So we only had one inventory account in Accounting 211. In Accounting 212, now we have multiple inventory accounts, right? We have a raw materials inventory, we have our goods in process or work in process inventory, and we have our finished goods inventory. Once these goods are finished, they're 100% for direct materials, 100% for direct labor, and 100% for overhead. Those costs then have to be moved over to the finished goods inventory out of the work in process inventory. So then the costs that are left should be the $130,000. So you should have $130,000 sitting there in your work in process inventory on your balance sheet. Okay? So that's doing process costing using the weighted average method. And your homework should be very, very similar to this.